It was Christmas Eve when my father stood up from the table, his fork still in his hand, and said, "You're not my daughter anymore." The clatter of silverware froze the room, and for a moment I thought I'd misheard him, that maybe the wine had gone to his head, or that he was making some kind of cruel joke. But then my mother nodded in agreement, her lips pressed so tightly I could barely see them. That was the night my parents disowned me. What they didn't know was that I would find the strength to disown them back, and I would never again let them dictate my worth or my place in this world. Christmas had always been tense in my family, though from the outside we looked picture perfect. Matching sweaters, smiling for the camera in front of the tree, carefully chosen gifts laid out under the lights. But underneath, the fractures ran, deep. My older brother, Ethan, was the golden child, the lawyer, the success story, the pride of my parents. I was the afterthought, the one who had wasted potential because I'd chosen art school, because I'd married a man who didn't come from money, because I refused to live my life on their terms. And that night, it all came crashing down in a way I could never have anticipated. It started small, with little barbs during dinner, my mother criticizing the way I dressed. "You should have worn something more appropriate for a family gathering." My father raising an eyebrow when my husband served me wine. "Doesn't she usually drink too much?" Ethan sat across from me, smirking as if he'd been waiting for the explosion all along. When dessert came out, my parents brought up money. They always did. "You're almost 30, my father said, cutting into his pie with sharp movements. "And what do you have to show for it? No house, no savings, no children. You chose your little projects over stability. That's not how we raised you." My husband reached for my hand under the table, a silent anchor. But my father's voice grew louder, and then the words that would split the night open fell. "You're not my daughter anymore." I could have screamed. I could have cried. But instead, I stared at the cranberry sauce smeared across my plate and felt a calm wash over me, colder than the winter outside. 5 minutes later, I made a decision that would change everything. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't even flinch. I simply folded my napkin, placed it on the table, and said, "All right, if that's what you want." My mother gasped as if I'd slapped her, but she didn't take the words back. Ethan leaned back in his chair, satisfied as though the throne he'd been waiting for was finally his. My father muttered something about respect and disappointment, but I wasn't listening anymore. My mind had gone somewhere sharper, clearer. I thought of every holiday I'd spent biting my tongue, every birthday card that came with a note reminding me I could still make something of myself, every time they praised Ethan in front of me while pretending not to notice how I shrank. It was always conditional love with them. Love as long as I performed, love as long as I obeyed, love as long as I didn't embarrass them. And that night, in the glow of the Christmas tree, I realized their conditions no longer applied. I pushed my chair back and stood, and the silence was deafening. My husband rose too, but I lifted a hand to stop him. This was mine to handle. "You've made your choice," I said evenly. "And now I'll make mine. You can't disown me because I'm already done being your daughter." My mother's fork slipped against her plate with a sharp scrape, and Ethan muttered, "Don't be dramatic." But I kept my eyes on my father. His face had gone pale, the flush of anger replaced by something else. Fear, maybe, or realization that he had just severed something he couldn't glue back together. I walked out into the cold night without looking back, the frost biting my skin. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. But freedom wasn't enough. They had stripped me of my family in front of witnesses, and now I had to show them what it meant when I stopped carrying their burdens. What happened after Christmas was not revenge in the way people imagine with shouting and slammed doors. It was paperwork, boundaries, silence, and all of it would hurt them far more than a tantrum ever could. The first step was quiet. I stopped answering their calls. My mother tried the next morning, then the day after, leaving voicemails that swung from guilt-laced, "You'll regret this when we're gone," to bitter, "You've broken this family apart." I didn't respond. When my father finally texted me a single line, "Come fix this," I blocked his number. Ethan sent me a photo of them all smiling around the table with the caption, "Family first." That was the last straw. I opened. my laptop and went through every account, every insurance policy, every old paper trail where my name had been tangled into theirs. Over the years, they had insisted on tying me into family investments and shared obligations, always, presenting it as if they were helping me. In reality, it was their way of controlling me, keeping me tethered so I couldn't drift too far. That week, I called every bank, every lawyer I could afford, and began cutting those ties one by one. There were hidden debts in my father's, name that I had unknowingly been co-signed onto, little traps he had set under the guise of building credit. I disputed them all, filed paperwork, and with each signature I felt another shackle fall away. When the bank confirmed that my liability was removed, I sat in my car in the parking lot and cried, not out of sadness, but from the weight finally lifting off my shoulders. Meanwhile, word began to spread in the extended family. Cousins reached out, confused, asking if it was true that I'd abandoned my parents. My parents spun their version of the story, painting me as ungrateful and cruel. But when I calmly sent over the receipts, literal receipts of financial entanglements, texts of insults, recordings of them berating me, the silence from my relatives told me everything. They had believed the facade for years, but now they saw the cracks. The more my parents tried to smear me, the more they exposed themselves. I didn't lash out, didn't argue. I just kept documenting, detaching, removing myself from their reach. And slowly, the family power shifted. Without me as the scapegoat, their cruelty began turning inward, and they had no one left to pin it on. I knew detaching wouldn't be easy, but I underestimated how much my parents relied on me being their constant punching bag, the one who always came back no matter how badly they treated me. That first month after Christmas, the silence between us wasn't peaceful. It was loud. My mother sent letters in her delicate handwriting, pages filled with phrases like "family is forever" and "you'll regret this childish stunt." But tucked between the lines was venom. "You're just jealous of your brother. You've embarrassed us long enough." I tore them up without finishing. Then came the financial sabotage. My father had always handled taxes for me when I was younger, insisting it was easier if I just did it. What I discovered, through hours of digging, was that he'd tied my name into his business filings in ways that left me vulnerable. It was subtle, intentional. He had essentially positioned me as a safety net if things ever went south for him. I was furious, not just at him, but at myself for trusting him all these years. But instead of confronting him, I did something better. I hired a new accountant, a woman who'd seen this kind of manipulation before. She combed through everything and started disentangling me, one form at a time. The look on her face when she found how deep his tactics went told me all I needed to know. This wasn't just neglect, this was calculated control. Meanwhile, Ethan thrived on the chaos. He posted photos of him and my parents, always with captions like, "True family sticks together," clearly aimed at me. For once, I didn't take the bait. I didn't respond, didn't comment, didn't even look at his page except to screenshot things for my growing folder of evidence, because I knew it was only a matter of time before their mask slipped in public. And it did. By February, my parents had hosted a neighborhood dinner, something they love to do to maintain their reputation as the perfect couple. But this time, the cracks showed. One of their guests, a longtime friend of the family, mentioned casually that she'd run into me at the bookstore and that I seemed happier than ever. According to another cousin who was there, my mother froze, her smile faltered, and my father snapped, "She's dead to us." The entire table went quiet. That sentence made its way through our extended family faster than wildfire, and suddenly, it wasn't me who looked ungrateful. It was them who looked unhinged. I let it spread. I let people whisper. I stayed silent because silence was power. By March, I had fully cut legal and financial ties. Every account that once had my name attached was scrubbed clean, every co-signature dissolved, every tether severed. It took weeks of phone calls, paperwork, verification, but I did it. My parents no longer had any claim over me, not my credit, not my records, not my future. And once I knew I was free, I made the boldest move of all. I drafted a letter. Wasn't an apology. It wasn't a plea. It was a formal no-contact statement, typed out, notarized, and delivered through certified mail. It said plainly that any further attempts to reach me would be considered harassment and that I would pursue legal protection if necessary. When that letter arrived at their doorstep, I imagined my father's face turning red, my mother clutching, her pearls, Ethan sneering behind them, but there was nothing they could do. The leash they'd kept around my neck for 30 years had snapped, and I wasn't coming back. What they didn't know yet, but would soon learn, was that freedom was only the beginning, because once I had no ties left to them, I was finally free to turn the mirror back onto them and force them to see the family they had really created. The months after I sent that no-contact letter were some of the strangest of my life, because I had expected a rush of relief that would never leave me, but instead it came in waves. First a deep quiet, then sudden jolts of panic when I realized just how much of my identity had been built around managing their moods. I would catch myself hesitating before making a decision, hearing my father's voice in the back of my mind saying, "That's not smart, that's not practical." I would see a new dress in a store window and automatically think of my mother's inevitable critique about it being too much or too cheap. I had to unlearn their voices before I could even hear my own. Therapy helped, but what helped more was watching them unravel without me. You see, my parents were always obsessed with image. Their Christmas parties, their neighborhood dinners, their constant social performances were designed to prove to the world that we were the perfect family. Without me there to play the scapegoat, their dysfunction had no outlet, and people began to notice. By April, a mutual family friend called me to say she had witnessed my father yelling at Ethan in a crowded restaurant, his face red, his voice booming loud enough for strangers to turn. He accused Ethan of mishandling some family business venture, something my father had always sworn Ethan was brilliant at. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I had been the failure, the one who never met their impossible standards. Now, with me gone, Ethan had no shield, and suddenly, he was the one under fire. But unlike me, Ethan wasn't built to endure it. He lashed out publicly, posting cryptic rants online about how loyalty means nothing, and blood doesn't guarantee respect. I watched from a distance, screenshots piling up on my phone, a record of their empire crumbling from within. The final crack came at Easter. My parents hosted another dinner, desperate to salvage their reputation, and several relatives told me the tension in that room was unbearable. My mother tried to play hostess, but she drank too much wine and ended up cornering one of my cousins, venting about how ungrateful children destroy families. My father made a toast that sounded more like a threat, declaring that real heirs know their place. And Ethan, tired of playing golden child, stormed out before dessert. For the first time in my life, I wasn't there, and yet I was still the invisible centerpiece of their chaos. I didn't need to argue or fight them anymore. Their own words and actions were enough. That was when I realized revenge didn't always look like fireworks or screaming matches. Sometimes it looked like silence, like absence, like refusing to be the fuel for their fire. My absence forced them to burn themselves down. And yet, as much as I wanted to simply move on, I knew I couldn't just vanish without leaving a message. They had spent decades using me as a cautionary tale to others, calling me a failure, saying I'd never make it without them. I wanted the world to see that not only had I survived, I had thrived. So I started sharing my art more publicly. The projects they had mocked as pointless began to find an audience. A small gallery offered me a spot in a local showcase, then another invited me to submit to a larger exhibition. For the first time, I wasn't just creating in the shadows, I was being seen. And when the reviews came in, glowing and supportive, I knew exactly who would read them. My parents always prided themselves on keeping tabs, even when they pretended not to care. I didn't send them the articles, didn't forward the invitations. I didn't have to. I knew they would find them, and I knew it would sting in ways my silence never could. They had disowned me, stripped me of my title as their daughter. But by building my own name, my own life, my own success, I disowned them right back. And this time, there was no coming back together, because the life I was creating didn't have room for their shadows anymore. By the time summer came around, my life felt like it belonged to me for the first time. But freedom is never as clean as we imagine it will be. I still woke up some mornings with the taste of old fear in my mouth, wondering if I had made a mistake, if cutting them out had been too extreme. That's what decades of conditioning does to you. It makes you question your own survival. But then I'd open my email and see another invitation, another opportunity that proved I wasn't just surviving. I was building something real. My art had become my salvation. I poured everything into it, every insult they had hurled at me, every bruise left by words sharper than knives, every silent dinner where I had swallowed my own voice. People saw my work and called it raw, emotional, honest. What they didn't know was that each canvas was me clawing my way out of the cage my family had locked me in. And while I was creating, they were unraveling further. I didn't have to spy. I didn't even want to. But gossip has a way of finding you when you least expect it. A neighbor ran into me at the grocery store and whispered about how my father had lost his temper in a board meeting, how investors were starting to pull back. My mother, once the immaculate hostess, had stopped showing up to her charity luncheons because people had started asking too many questions about where I was and why they hadn't spoken to me. And Ethan. Oh, Ethan was drowning. The golden boy who had always lived in the glow of their approval suddenly found himself under the same scrutiny I'd endured my entire life. Without me to absorb the blame, every crack in his facade widened. He began making reckless decisions, flaunting money he didn't have, posting photos of luxury trips that everyone knew he couldn't afford. Whispers of debt started to follow. Whispers that made my parents' friends pull away slowly, like smoke clearing from a room. I stayed silent, but silence is not the same as absence. My absence became the loudest statement of all. At a cousin's wedding in June, they showed up alone, stiff and brittle, trying to pretend everything was fine, but everyone noticed that I wasn't there. They noticed that their once perfect family had a missing piece, and no one bought the lies anymore. I didn't need to defend myself. The truth was doing the work for me. What struck me most was how they kept trying to bait me back in. A letter would arrive in careful handwriting, this time softer, filled with lines like, "We only want what's best for you." Then, 2 weeks later, another message would arrive, filled with venom again. "You'll regret this when you're alone." It was the same old cycle, sweet with poison underneath. But here's the thing. I wasn't alone anymore. My husband stood by me through every step, his quiet support the complete opposite of the chaos I grew up in. And the friends I had always been too scared to fully lean on became family in a way my blood never could. We hosted our own dinners, small and imperfect, filled with laughter that didn't have to be forced for photographs. It was messy, sometimes loud, sometimes late into the night, but it was real. And that's when it hit me. My parents hadn't disowned me at all. I'd already left them years ago in my heart, every time I swallowed down who I was to make them comfortable. That Christmas was just the first time they said it out loud. They thought they had taken something from me, but in truth, all they did was confirm what I already knew, that I was never truly theirs to keep. What followed wasn't a clean break. It was a slow burn, a quiet storm, a long process of learning. That revenge didn't mean destroying them. It meant building something stronger for myself. And every time their empire cracked, every time someone whispered to me about their latest scandal or humiliation, I didn't gloat. I just smiled. Because I had finally learned the most important lesson of all. I didn't need their approval, their love, or even their acknowledgement. The moment I chose myself, I had already won. By the fall, the distance between us had become more than just emotional. It was visible, undeniable, something that even the most loyal relatives couldn't ignore. Invitations to their grand holiday dinners had dwindled. The people who used to orbit around my parents, eager to bask in their perfect family image, now kept their distance. I heard whispers that they had canceled their annual 4th of July party, claiming it was too much work this year. But the truth was simpler. Fewer and fewer people wanted to show up, and the empty chairs spoke louder than any excuse. For decades, I had been the scapegoat, the convenient target, the lightning rod for all their frustrations. Without me, they were forced to confront each other, and their ugly truth started spilling into the open. Ethan, once their star, had begun to self-destruct. He tried to launch a business with borrowed money, the kind of flashy investment my father would normally brag about, but it collapsed within months. Rumors of unpaid debts and angry investors spread quickly, And suddenly the golden boy wasn't so golden. My parents, who had always defended him no matter what, couldn't shield him anymore without exposing their own failings. And then came the ultimate irony. They needed help. Not from Ethan, who was sinking fast, but from me, the daughter they had disowned. A relative reached out quietly to let me know my father had been asking questions about me, about whether I had come to my senses yet. By winter, a full year after that Christmas night, the shift was complete. I no longer measured time by their moods or their approval. I measured it by my own milestones, my own quiet victories. The first holiday season without them was strange. At first, like an empty space at a table, but that space soon filled with something warmer. My husband and I hosted a small dinner with friends who had become our chosen family. We didn't have crystal goblets or silver platters. We had mismatched plates, a roast chicken, laughter that spilled into the night, and not a single moment where I felt like I had to hide who I was. That was when it hit me. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Meanwhile, my parents were still unraveling. Their social circle, once wide and admiring, had shrunk down to a handful of loyal acquaintances who were either too afraid or too oblivious to walk away. Even those people noticed the cracks. A family friend told me she had visited their house in December and found my mother pacing in her robe, ranting about betrayal, while my father sat silent, staring at a pile of unpaid bills on the kitchen table. It was almost surreal to hear, because for so long they had been the picture of control, the puppeteers pulling strings from above. Now they were exposed, and it wasn't because I had set out to ruin them. They had ruined themselves when they chose pride over love. Ethan had moved back in with them after his financial collapse, something I never thought I'd see. The golden child, once their shining example, now slept in his old bedroom, a man in his 30s hiding from the mess he'd made. And my parents, who once held him up as proof of their success, now carried the weight of his failures alongside their own. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. But what I felt, more than anything, was distance. Their downfall didn't bring me joy. It just confirmed what I had always known, that their empire was built on sand, and it was never my job to hold it up. My revenge wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. It was in the quiet fact that while they were sinking deeper into bitterness and decay, I was building something real, something lasting, and they could no longer touch it. On Christmas night, exactly 1 year later, I lit a single candle by the window, not for them, not as an invitation, but as a symbol for myself, a reminder that I had walked out of the cold and into the warmth of my own life. That night, instead of cranberry sauce and biting remarks, there was wine, music, and a room full of people who saw me, not the scapegoat, not the failure, not the daughter who disappointed, but me. And as I laughed with them, I realized the truth. They thought they had disowned me. But really, I had disowned them first, and it was the best decision I ever made. The second year without them proved something I hadn't believed was possible. That life could not only continue without my parents, but actually bloom. By spring, I was preparing for my largest art show yet, a collection that drew directly from the pain of my past, but transformed it into something striking and undeniable. The pieces were raw, textured, unapologetic. They spoke of absence, of silence, of a woman carving herself out of stone walls that once seemed unbreakable. Critics wrote about the power of reclamation and the beauty of defiance. But for me, it was simpler. It was proof that I had taken the very weapons they had used against me and turned them into tools to build something greater. My parents couldn't ignore it. I know, because Ethan showed up at the opening. He didn't approach me, didn't even make eye contact. But I saw him lingering at the edge of the crowd, his jaw tight, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He looked older, worn, the arrogance stripped away. For years, he had been my tormentor, the smirking prince in our family's twisted hierarchy. Now he stood on the outside looking in. And for the first time, I realized he wasn't a threat anymore. He was just another casualty of our parents' cruelty. Later that night, someone told me he had left quickly after a journalist asked him if he was the brother mentioned in the artist's biography. He didn't answer. He just walked out. That was when I understood that my silence, My refusal to play their game had not only freed me, it had trapped them in their own. My mother tried again after that, sending one last letter, this one trembling, with desperation rather than rage. "We can start over," she wrote. "Family is too important to throw away. Think of the holidays, the traditions, the legacy." I read it once, folded it neatly, and slid it into a drawer. I didn't respond, because what she still didn't understand was that family isn't about legacy or appearances or control. It's about love, safety, and respect. And those were things they had never given me. As summer turned into fall, I built new traditions. Friends gathered in my home, bringing food, music, and stories that filled the air with laughter. My husband and I planted a garden, small but thriving, and each bloom felt like a victory, a reminder that growth comes when the soil is nourished, not poisoned. And every milestone, every gallery invitation, every article published, every small joy, I carried with me not as proof to them, but as proof to myself that I had survived. The longer I stayed away, the clearer it became. They had lost their grip on me forever. Their home was shrinking into silence, their social circle dissolving, their empire collapsing. Mine was expanding, and that was the deepest revenge of all. Because while they wasted their lives clinging to control, I was finally learning how to live. By the third Christmas, their absence didn't ache anymore. It barely registered. What once felt like a raw wound had scarred over into something tougher, something I could glance at without flinching. I didn't dread the season, didn't fear the ghosts of family dinners past. Instead, I decorated our house with lights that glowed warm against the snow, cooked recipes that had never existed on my mother's table, and filled the rooms with people who weren't bound to me by blood, but by choice. Friends, neighbors, colleagues. They brought casseroles, laughter, mismatched wine glasses. It was imperfect and chaotic, and yet it was the happiest I had ever been during the holidays. Meanwhile, the whispers about my parents kept trickling in. A cousin called me one afternoon, her voice hushed, to say that my father had lost his seat on a local board after too many public outbursts. My mother, once the face of every charity gala, was now barely attending, claiming health issues, though everyone knew it was pride. Their reputation had eroded so completely that even people who once idolized them now shook their heads. They had wanted to punish me with exile, but instead, they had exiled themselves. Ethan, too, had faded into the background. He still lived, under their roof, no longer the golden boy, just another broken branch on the family tree. He occasionally tried to bait me, an email under a fake account, a snide comment passed through relatives. But I didn't bite. I had no reason to. His power over me had ended the moment I stopped believing I owed him anything. That was the quiet victory I hadn't anticipated, realizing that revenge didn't require confrontation. It required indifference. And that indifference, that refusal to engage, was more cutting than any angry words I could have thrown. In those years, I built something entirely separate, something untouchable. My art reached audiences I once thought were beyond my grasp. My husband and I traveled, small trips at first, then bigger ones, Paris in the spring, Rome in the fall. We wandered through museums where I had once dreamed of seeing my work, and I stood before paintings centuries old, realizing I had joined a lineage not of blood, but of creation. And in those moments, I thought of my parents, not with longing, not with hate, but with clarity. They had reduced me to nothing in their eyes, but in doing so, they had forced me to see that I was everything in mine. That was the truth they could never escape. They disowned me to destroy me, but in disowning them back, I had finally set myself free. And every success, every smile, every candle lit in my home became proof of a life they could never touch again. When the fourth year rolled around, I finally understood the depth of what I had done. Cutting ties hadn't just freed me, it had rewritten my entire story. For decades, my parents had cast me as the supporting character, the failure, the one whose role was to make their golden boy shine brighter. But with every passing season, I stepped further into the role of my own heroine. The difference was startling. I no longer walked into rooms braced for judgment. I no longer measured myself against Ethan's hollow victories. I no longer heard my father's cutting tone in my head when I made decisions. Instead, there was space. Space to breathe, to create, to love without fear. By then, my parents' world was little more than a crumbling house of mirrors. Their perfect image was gone, their allies had scattered, and their conversations, when they reached me through whispers of cousins or family friends, were filled with bitterness and blame. They still hadn't learned. They still thought in terms of control, of power, of legacy. They couldn't understand that their greatest loss wasn't my obedience, it was my absence. Ethan had become almost invisible. He rarely appeared online anymore. And when he did, it was clear he was living in the shadow of everything he once mocked me for. He had no career, no independence, no real relationships outside of my parents' crumbling home. He had become exactly what they feared I would be, a dependent adult with nothing to show for himself. And though a part of me pitied him, I didn't reach out. I couldn't. He had been their weapon against me for too long, and saving him wasn't my job. That was another cycle I had broken, believing I had to carry the weight of everyone else's mistakes. My weight was gone, replaced with something else entirely. Strength, clarity, peace. That Christmas, I stood in my own home, surrounded by friends who had become family, laughter echoing off walls I had painted myself. My husband kissed me under the twinkling lights, and in that moment, I realized I hadn't thought of my parents once all day. Not once. They were no longer the center of my story. They were just the prologue to a life that was finally mine. That, I realized, was the truest form of revenge. Not proving them wrong, not watching them fall, but living so fully that their absence didn't matter anymore. By the 5th Christmas, something inside me shifted for good. I no longer framed my life as before and after my parents' rejection. Their voices had once haunted every decision I made, like ghosts sitting on my shoulders, whispering criticism into my ear. But now, those ghosts were quiet. When I thought about my childhood home, the polished floors, the staged family portraits, the suffocating pressure to perform, it felt like a museum I had walked out of long ago, one I'd never visit again. My life had texture now, color, flaws that made it beautiful. The art I created carried the marks of my journey, dark strokes for the pain, bright bursts for the freedom, layered canvases that told stories I once could never speak. And the world listened. My shows grew larger, my name carried further, and each review, each collector's interest, was another reminder that I had carved out a place my parents never believed I could. I learned that healing isn't a single moment of triumph. It's dozens of small choices over and over to put yourself first. And while I was choosing myself, they were unraveling further. By then, my parents had lost nearly everything that once propped them up. Their business ventures had dried up. Their social circle had shrunk to a handful of equally bitter acquaintances, and even those had grown tired of the endless drama. I heard that their house, the one where I had endured so many cutting remarks and cold dinners, had gone quiet. No more parties, no more galas, no more carefully staged family photos. Just silence, punctuated by arguments that leaked into the neighborhood. Ethan, still living under their roof, had become their mirror, resentful, trapped, clinging to the same illusions they once forced on me. The irony was almost poetic. The golden boy, the chosen one, reduced to the very dependence they had always accused me of. But I didn't gloat. I didn't even feel satisfaction. I simply felt distance, like watching a storm rage across the ocean while I stood safely on shore. That was the ultimate revenge. Not their downfall, but my freedom. Not the sight of them sinking, but the knowledge that I would never sink with them again. And as I stood in my own living room, surrounded by laughter, food, and people who chose me for who I was, not for the image I could uphold, I realized I no longer needed them to see my worth. I saw it myself, clearer than ever. They had disowned me. I had disowned them. And somewhere in between, I had found myself. By the 6th Christmas, the story of my family had turned into something almost myth-like among relatives and old acquaintances. Whispers of how the daughter they disowned had built a life without them, how the parents who once ruled every dinner table with pride had crumbled into silence. People would ask me sometimes, carefully, if I ever thought about reconciling. The truth? No. Because reconciliation requires two sides willing to face the truth, and my parents had never been capable of that. They didn't want peace. They wanted control, and I had no intention of stepping back into their cage. By then, my life was unrecognizable compared to the one I left behind. My husband and I had traveled more, not to escape, but to explore. We'd stood in front of the Eiffel Tower, shared gelato in Florence, walked hand in hand along quiet beaches where no one knew our names. Those moments weren't about proving anything. They were about living fully, something I never got to do when my worth was measured against Ethan's shadow. My art had gone further than I ever imagined. A museum had reached out, requesting one of my pieces for a traveling exhibit. Me, the failure, the disappointment, the daughter they erased, was now leaving a mark that would outlive them. And when I stood in the gallery one night, watching strangers pause, tilt their heads, and lose themselves in my work, I thought of my parents not with bitterness, but with a strange kind of pity. They had clipped their own wings by refusing to see me for who I was. They chose control over connection, pride over love. And in the end, they were left with nothing but their own shadows. I, on the other hand, was surrounded by warmth. That Christmas, our home was filled again. Friends, neighbors, even colleagues who had become close enough to be family. We cooked together, spilled wine on the tablecloth, laughed until our stomachs hurt. No one was pretending, no one was performing. It was messy, it was real, it was ours. And for the first time, I realized I had stopped counting the years since that fateful dinner. It no longer defined me. It was simply the night that marked the end of one story and the beginning of another. My parents thought they had disowned me, erased me from their legacy. But the truth was simpler. I had written my own legacy, one they could never touch. Their house was dark that holiday, their empire gone, their voices reduced to bitter echoes. Mine was light, alive, full of joy, and that, I knew, was the only ending I ever needed. By the 7th year, the memory of that night had dulled. No longer a wound, but a scar I could trace without pain. Christmas arrived quietly, and instead of dread, I felt anticipation. My husband and I had built our own traditions, baking late into the night, exchanging small, thoughtful gifts instead of grand displays, inviting people who had no other family to join our table. Our home became a refuge, not just for us, but for others too. A place where no one had to earn love by suffering for it. Sometimes I would catch myself wondering if my parents ever sat in their cold dining room, staring at the empty chairs, where laughter used to be. I wondered if my mother still clutched her pearls when someone mentioned my name, if my father still bristled with rage when reminded that I had walked away. But the truth is, it didn't matter anymore. Their choices had locked them in a house filled with bitterness, while mine had opened doors to a life filled with warmth. Ethan had all but disappeared from everyone's radar. I heard faint whispers of him still living under their roof, a man who never learned how to stand without their approval propping him up. In a twisted way, he had become the very fate they once threatened me with, and yet I felt no triumph in it. Only clarity. He was a mirror of everything I had escaped. My revenge was never loud. It wasn't in shouting or slamming doors or demanding apologies I'd never receive. It was in the quiet moments, sitting by the fire with my husband's hand in mine, listening to friends' laughter echo through rooms I had painted myself, seeing my art displayed in cities my parents would never step foot in. That was revenge, thriving in a life they told me I could never have, and doing it without them. On Christmas Eve, as the snow fell softly outside, I stood at the window and realized I hadn't thought of them all day until that moment. And when I did, it wasn't with longing or hate. It was with distance, the kind you feel when looking at a house far away on a dark hill. They were part of my past, but not my present, not my future. I raised a glass that night, not to them, but to myself, the daughter they disowned, the woman who chose herself instead, the life that grew brighter each year because I had finally learned that family isn't who claims you. Family is who loves you. And I had found mine. By the 8th Christmas, the rhythm of my life no longer pulsed in reaction to theirs. It moved to its own steady beat. I woke up that morning to the smell of cinnamon rolls baking in the oven, music playing low in the background, my husband humming softly as he set the table. The tree sparkled in the corner, not with perfectly matched ornaments like the ones my mother once demanded, but with mismatched treasures collected from travels and gifts from friends. Each piece told a story, each story a reminder that life was richer when it was imperfect. Later, our house filled again, friends carrying casseroles, neighbors dropping by with bottles of wine, children running through the halls with flushed cheeks from the cold. The sound of laughter wrapped itself around me like a blanket, and I stood for a moment just taking it in. There was no tension, no barbed remarks hidden in compliments, no pressure to perform, just joy, messy and unfiltered. And yet, in the quiet moments between, I still thought of them. Not with longing, not even with anger, but with a strange kind of curiosity. What did their Christmas look like now? Were they still sitting in that same dining room, the same table where my father had once declared I was no longer his daughter? Did they still polish the silver, light the candles, arrange the plates as if the performance could mask the emptiness? Or had even that crumbled, leaving them with nothing but silence and regret? I never asked, never tried to find out. Because while part of me wondered, a larger part knew it didn't matter. Their world had shrunk to 4 walls of bitterness, while mine kept expanding outward, brighter each year. By the 9th Christmas, I finally understood the shape of my life without them. It was whole. The past no longer clawed at me, no longer pulled me backward. It sat quietly behind me, a closed book on a dusty shelf. A story that once defined me, but no longer controlled me. That Christmas morning, I stood in the kitchen, coffee in hand, watching the snow fall outside our window. My husband kissed my cheek, our friends began to stir in the guest room, and I realized I had everything I once begged my parents to give me. Safety, love, belonging, but I had built it myself, with people who chose me as much as I chose them. News of my parents still trickled in from time to time. Their house had grown quiet, their circle almost non-existent. Ethan was still there, stuck in the very dependence they had always sworn I would fall into. My mother's health had begun to fade, my father's temper had burned out into bitterness, and together they lived in the shadows of a reputation they could no longer uphold. They had disowned me to punish me. But in the end, they punished themselves, cut off from the one person who might have stood by them had they ever chosen love over pride. I didn't feel joy in their decline. I didn't feel vengeance. What I felt was freedom, the kind of freedom that comes when you finally realize you don't need someone else's apology to move forward. My revenge wasn't in their downfall. It was in the life I had created in spite of them, the joy I carried in my bones, the family I built out of choice, not blood. That night, as candles flickered and laughter filled the room, I raised my glass and spoke the words that had lived in me for years. They thought they disowned me, but really, I was never theirs to begin with. I belonged to myself. And with that, the story was done, not because they ended it, but because I had.